17. The Upper City. Berani's legs ached with an exhaustion far greater than the flight across the outer fields warranted. His mouth was dry, and his breath came to him as if he were still locked in a face-to-face struggle with the enemy. His heart had not slowed in all the time between the opening siren and his emergence into the once manicured manse of the Upper City, and in several moments light-headed terror, standing amidst the confused tangle of Marines and Ugh soldiery pouring in through the north wall, he felt almost as if his lungs could not catch the air about him, and his ribs might crack with the force of the fiery pounding in his chest. But he did not fall dead under the boiling fear and fury within him, and a few seconds in, Pahala, who had guided him by the arm most of the way, leaned in to occupy his vision and capture his wavering attention. "You all right? No bad hits?" Berani stared back at Pahala a moment, ears ringing with more than just the aftermath of roaring gunfire, eventually saying, "I'm fine." Then Samudra was on him, saying, "I'm going to get Darmong to a proper medical outfit and then get back here. Where are we headed now? Do we have an assigned area on the next wall?" Berani was again silent. Pahala waved Samudra off, telling him to get on with it and come back fast, that they wouldn't move from the spot. Agama, though Samudra urged him to follow, firmly denied any help with his shoulder, for the bullet had not hit bone, and though it must be agony to him, he refused to go sit the coming day by. After Samudra was seen away, it took Berani about half a minute, slowly craning to and fro and drinking in his surroundings, to fully believe he was there, and ground himself in the moment. Though he did remember the journey south through the fields in vague spans, it was for a terrible few seconds as if he had appeared in a strange environment without cause, a dreamlike teleportation, forcing him to retrace his steps and assure himself that he was where he was. "I don't think we have a follow-up position marked out," Berani said. "Satri is dead. He would have had the assignments." Agama, who had ducked away to lead Samudra and Darmong in the right direction, was back beside them then. He waved the worry away. "Don't worry about it just yet," the older man told them. "There's already garrisons on all the walls. We'll probably be told where to go as soon as the Ugh get a grip on where the breaches are, and start shuffling men around to respond to them. But we can keep our eyes open for other officers while we wait on Samudra, just in case." Berani thought for a moment of his father at the word officers, but the face of the Raja was buried as soon as it had been summoned. Had his thoughts and perceptions not been so ransacked by adrenaline and the aftershock of bloodshed, he might well have marveled at the ease with which they were buried. But as it was, he simply swallowed them and continued to scan the district about him. They stood in the shadow of a fortress gatehouse not far north of the Port Solar. The buildings about them were often marred by shellfire, with single walls or corners having been blown in or collapsed by concussive blasts. But many others glowered tall back at him from the darkness, almost untouched, sheer fortune having spared them the devastation brought to their neighbors. Beautiful as the old city had been in the light of day, it was now a strange and foreboding maze drenched in dour shadow. Its narrow alleys and shaded courts seemed suddenly black and dangerous, and the glinting gilding of its many etchings and designs against the distant flashes of flare and fire winked at him through the gloom like the eyes of predators in the dark. He thought of the Sholoshaishans on the northern field, and how their eyes had flashed in the flare light, and then his mind was already painting them into the obscure nooks and avenues of the cityscape. How long, he silently asked himself, until they were truly inside? The streets nearest them were packed so tight with the survivors of the outer wall, and the militia, ministering temple priests, and medical aides which had come forth to see to them, that it was difficult to maintain their spot next to the gnarled root tower of an ancient, massive plane tree which shaded the square in which they stood, half its canopy torn away and left to wither on the brickwork by shrapnel. The ebb and flow of men in and out of the court before the gates was utter chaos, and before long, the trio were pressed up against the vast planter of the shading tree in a desperate attempt not to be bumped away. Berani had just begun to doubt that Samudra would find his way back to them when the lanky man bobbed back into sight without Darmang, his mission fulfilled. Berani waved him into the group again, asking, "Darmang all right?" "Yeah," Samudra said. "They're taking him to the ziggurat." "Where now?" "We have to get away from the gate if we aren't getting put on the wall," Berani called to them over the clamor of distant shouts and even more distant fire. "They'll start shelling the inner gatehouses the second they get their guns close enough for it, and this crowd is going to get ground up like raw meat if it's not split up by the time the shooting starts." Samudra, looking towards the exits into neighboring streets, asked, "Which direction?" But Agama had already begun to shoulder them a path through the drifts of Ug and Lautani onto a more open road leading south of the span, deeper into the tangle. Berani, falling into place beside him, watched for lieutenants or higher officers in the tropic blues of Lautan to whom he could direct questions as they went, but none presented themselves. Most everyone of their kindred the four of them saw were, like them, small fish. How many, he wondered, of the higher-ups among the Marines had even made it out? They drew water from their canteens and filled the things in garden basins at the houses they passed as they went, for who knew how long it would be before a proper station for rations of food or drink was met. Samudra insisted during one of these lulls that he should inspect the graze along Berani's hip from the wall, but as the wound was superficial, there was nothing for it but to grit teeth and move on. The throng around them was an untidy mix of kingdom and duumvirate forces, and voices, many incomprehensible to Berani, shouted to find comrades or medics in the crowd. As minutes dragged by, and the far-off sirens on this or that wall continued to wail down the avenues of Sirgirkar, and no Ug command came out to rally the combined forces for redirection, Berani began to wonder where they were. For surely, even if the command structures housed in all the forts of the northern wall were wiped out, the Lionfolk still had a central core of officers in the inner city, ready to redirect the soldiery where it was needed. Then, before even he could ask that question aloud, Agama yanked him and Samudra aside, with Pahala tumbling after, up against a shrapnel-kissed wall siding the avenue. A line of several dozen of the glinting royal guard of the city were speeding mounted down the path, the stride of their vast war lions silent beneath despite their speed. They were calling out in the tongue of the Ug, but to Berani and the others, blind to what the calls meant, the words had simply faded into the auditory jumble echoing up and down the teeming streets. The lion riders rolled past, and in their wake, many of the Ug on foot in the throng began to run after them, flocking to westward paths through the looming manse of the night-draped upper city. And, as their little band of four was swept up in the tide of advance, Berani heard far off the accented shout in his own tongue. "They're through the west wall. They're in the city. Hurry." And hurry they did. Stumbles and sprains were an ever-present danger in the blackness, for the flares of the walls were, in the beginning, too far away to provide any real illumination in the chasm streets of the upper city. But as they wound mile after mile west through the district, the need not to be trampled underfoot by the thousands behind kept men focused and steady on their boots. Lungs seared, and the exhaustion of the flight from the outer wall was compounded by this second great charge for the city's flank, which lasted, for those of them who had begun it over near the city's center, over an hour. Flares rose from the north wall off to their right a half hour in, and before the hour was out, massed fire on that barrier told them the Sholoshaitians were already pushing on the inner defenses they'd escaped through. The crack of gunshots echoed far up the streets ahead. They were not within sight of the west wall, through the manse of corridors between buildings, when explosions rose up in their midst. Pahala, gasping as his legs pumped steadily on beside them, yelled, "Artillery!" But it was not, they would soon find, artillery which was carrying off legs and chunks of boot or thigh in the ranks of the defenders, toppling handfuls to be leapt over or trampled in the streets. It was mortars. The Shaitians were already inside, and though their artillery pieces beyond the walls were too timid about ravaging their own soldiery to fire from afar anymore, the mortar teams were close and agile enough to rain death regardless. And then the terrible nature of once beautiful Sirgirkar finally came home to Berani. For though dawn was breaking the horizon off at their backs, and the faintly brightening sky was lit here by the still lingering flares of the west wall, the clan compounds of the Ug which had not been leveled by shell radiated rifle fire ahead. Ug families or militia within were perched atop the walled gardens of the homes as if they were battlements, and firing on the half-glimpsed silhouettes of Sholoshaitians who had swept homes in the shadow of the wall, and were now garrisoning the ruins. The spark of glinting eyes, the flare of a muzzle's flash, the echoed shouts of Ug or Shaitian or Lautani in the gloom as the mortars rained in a street rapidly choking with the bodies of the slain, and the cries and groans of the mortally wounded. The brick was slick with rain and blood, boots skidding on its surface as they skewed for this or that avenue away from the slaughter. Along the far edge of the street, a bent line of women carrying or herding young children from some compromised cellar or shelter were fleeing against the crowd, and the shrieks of them were evident even amidst the din of battle. "Come on!" It was Agama and Pahala again who dragged them on. They tucked sidelong into an alley between two clan compounds, and then, Berani taking the lead once more, they wheeled impulsively through the bombed-out rear wall of a home place along the way. The sound of shouted Lautani words, in the different but still familiar dialects of the northern island of Sahirau, called to Berani. They passed through an inner court and into the frontal dining and ritual rooms, whose narrow windows, constructed almost after the fashion of firing ports on lower floors, as was the custom of the Ug, were already stationed with men uniformed just as they were. A man with a corporal's markings, spinning with rifle half raised to look back at them as they entered, called, "Who are you?" "We're from Jalawa," Berani called back, already crossing to the front windows to take up position alongside them. "Here to help." The corporal from Sahirau did not question them further. By the look of the haggard men he had with him, the northern islander was likely not much better equipped or informed for the situation than they were. And yet still, he had taken the initiative and led his men with him to their posts, where they fired out down the street towards the enemy. Overhead, more guns, perhaps of his soldiers, perhaps of the family of the house, fired with them from the roof. Berani and the others wasted no time and joined the fight. "I don't have much more ammunition," Pahala panted beside him, almost inaudible amidst the ringing of fire. "None of us do," Agama shouted back. And yet, low or not, as the dust and fragments of enemy bullets tore up the brickwork of the wall behind which they hid, they had little choice but to keep low and shoot well when the time came to rise and fire. One of the Sahirau men off to their right was shot through the mouth, and though he was not dead, lay gurgling and moaning in the dust at their feet. Agama was grazed again in the neck, not deep, but certainly enough to deepen the red stains upon his uniform. And Samudra, his glasses having miraculously remained intact all through the long night, had his lenses shattered by stray shards of brick thrown up from the window's bottom, and cowered long on the floor picking at the glass lodged in his left eye. Eventually, he packed tight a compress over it, slid his turban low over the bloodied eye, and went back to firing as best he could, never complaining of the struggle. So it was with all the beleaguered men, Ug or Lautani, who had rushed west to meet the invader, or else been pushed back from the bowels of the west wall itself to fight in the streets. And as the sun rose over Sirgirkar, they began to run dry of ammunition.